Picture this: the most powerful man in America and the most respected religious leader in the world are sitting just 10 feet apart in the United Nations General Assembly Hall. Cameras from every major network are rolling live. The tension in the room is so thick, you could cut it with a knife. President Donald Trump has just finished making his case about border security and immigration enforcement. His words are sharp, direct, and uncompromising. The audience of world leaders shifts uncomfortably in their seats. Then Pope Leo XIV, the first American to ever hold the papal office, leans forward into his microphone. The room falls completely silent. What he says next will either create the biggest diplomatic crisis of the decade or demonstrate why millions of people around the world see him as a true spiritual leader. But here's what nobody in that room expected. After disagreeing with the President of the United States on live television, the Pope does something that catches everyone completely off guard. Something that transforms not just the room, but potentially the entire conversation about immigration in America. Stay with me, because what happens next reveals exactly why Pope Leo XIV has become one of the most influential voices of our time, and why even his critics have to admit he possesses something most politicians have lost: genuine moral authority. To understand why this moment was so explosive, you need to know what was happening in America during the spring of 2025. President Trump was deep into what many political analysts were calling the most polarized presidential campaign in modern history. Immigration had become the defining issue, with polls showing the country split almost exactly down the middle. On one side, Trump supporters argued that unchecked immigration was destroying American communities, overwhelming social services, and threatening national security. On the other side, his opponents claimed that harsh enforcement policies were separating families and betraying America's values as a nation of immigrants. Into this heated political moment stepped Pope Leo XIV, formerly Bishop Robert Francis Prevost from Ohio, just 18 months earlier. He had shocked the world by becoming the first American pope in the Catholic Church's 2,000-year history. His election had been controversial enough within Vatican circles, but his approach to leadership had been even more surprising. Unlike previous popes who carefully avoided American domestic politics, Leo XIV had made it clear he wouldn't stay silent on issues he considered fundamental moral questions. He had already spoken out about economic inequality, environmental protection, and what he called the crisis of spiritual emptiness in modern society. But immigration was different. This wasn't just a political issue for the Pope. During his years as a bishop in Peru, he had worked directly with families fleeing poverty and violence. He had seen children separated from their parents, witnessed the desperation that drives people to risk everything for a chance at a better life. The Interfaith Conference at the United Nations was supposed to be a routine diplomatic event. Religious leaders from around the world would offer brief remarks about global cooperation and peace. President Trump had agreed to participate as part of his administration's outreach to religious communities before the election. Nobody expected a confrontation. The event organizers had carefully scripted the proceedings to avoid controversy. Each speaker had submitted their remarks in advance. The topics were supposed to be broad and unifying: the importance of faith in public life, the need for compassion in governance, the shared values that unite all people of goodwill. But Pope Leo XIV had developed a reputation for going off script when he felt the moment called for it. Vatican insiders knew he was deeply concerned about what he saw as the dehumanization of immigrants in American political discourse. Friends close to the Pope said he had been praying for weeks about whether to speak more directly about the issue. The stakes couldn't have been higher. A public disagreement between the Pope and the President would dominate news cycles for weeks. It could influence Catholic voters, who make up roughly 20% of the American electorate. It could either help or hurt Trump's chances in what was already shaping up to be an extremely close race. More importantly, it would test whether Pope Leo XIV was truly the transformational leader his supporters believed him to be, or just another religious figure who would fold under political pressure as the two men took their seats that morning in the iconic General Assembly Hall. Surrounded by world leaders, diplomats, and journalists, nobody could have predicted that. They were about to witness one of the most remarkable moments in modern American political and religious history. The confrontation was about to begin, but the real story wasn't the disagreement itself. It was how Pope Leo XIV would choose to respond when directly challenged by the most powerful man in the world. The morning session had proceeded exactly as planned. The Secretary General delivered opening remarks about the United Nations' commitment to interfaith dialogue. The Archbishop of Canterbury offered a brief prayer for world peace. Rabbi Sarah Goldman from New York spoke movingly about the shared Abrahamic tradition of welcoming strangers. Then President Trump approached the podium. His prepared remarks focused on the importance of faith in American life and his administration's commitment to religious freedom. But as he neared the end of his speech, he deviated from the script. His voice took on the familiar cadence that had energized his political rallies for nearly a decade. "The folks in this room talk a lot about compassion," he said, looking directly at the assembled religious leaders. "But real compassion means protecting American families first. It means securing our borders so that drugs don't pour into our communities and destroy our children's lives." You can sense the shift in the room immediately. Several delegates exchanged glances. The Pope, seated just 20 feet away in the front row, kept his expression carefully neutral, but his hands folded slightly tighter in his lap. Trump continued, "We've been told that enforcing immigration law is somehow uncharitable, that expecting people to follow legal processes is somehow unchristian. But I ask you this, what's charitable about allowing criminal cartels to exploit desperate people? What's Christian about enabling human trafficking?" The president's voice grew stronger as he warmed to his theme. "Some religious leaders," he said, with a pointed glance toward the Pope, "seem to think that having an open heart means having open borders. But that's not wisdom. That's not compassion. That's just foolishness that gets people killed." The room was now completely silent, except for the soft whir of television cameras. Pope Leo XIV's face remained serene, but something had changed in his posture. He was no longer simply listening. He was preparing. When Trump finished his remarks, to polite but notably restrained applause, the moderator announced a brief break before the Pope's scheduled address. During those 10 minutes, Vatican spokesman Father Martinez was seen having an intense whispered conversation with the Pope. Several observers later reported that the Pope shook his head, firmly, and said something that looked like "not today." When Pope Leo XIV approached the podium, the atmosphere in the General Assembly Hall was electric. Every person in the room understood they were about to witness something unprecedented. The cameras focused tightly on his face as he adjusted the microphone and looked out over the assembly. For nearly 10 seconds, he said nothing. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Then he began to speak in the clear, measured tone that had become his trademark. "President Trump," he said, looking directly at the American leader, "has spoken passionately about protecting families. This is good. Families should be protected. Children should be safe. Communities should be secure. On these things, we completely agree." A murmur of relief rippled through the room. Perhaps this would be a diplomatic response, after all. Perhaps the Pope would find a way to affirm the president while avoiding direct confrontation. But then the Pope's tone shifted subtly. "However," he continued, "I must respectfully disagree with the assumption that compassion and security are enemies of each other. In my experience serving the poorest communities in Peru, I learned that true security comes not from walls and barriers, but from justice and human dignity." The president's jaw tightened visibly. Several cameras caught him leaning forward in his chair, his expression hardening. The Pope pressed on with gentle but unmistakable firmness. When Jesus spoke about welcoming the stranger, he didn't include a footnote about checking their documentation first. When he commanded us to feed the hungry, he didn't suggest we first verify their citizenship status. Now the confrontation was fully in the open. The most respected religious leader in the world was directly challenging the immigration policies of the President of the United States, with the entire world watching. But Pope Leo XIV wasn't finished. With that same calm authority that had made him famous during his years as Bishop Prévost, "You speak of criminal cartels and human trafficking as if these evils justify abandoning our moral obligations to refugees and asylum seekers. But these crimes flourish precisely because we have created a system that forces desperate people into the shadows." The camera operators were having a field day, cutting back and forth between the Pope's steady gaze and Trump's increasingly tense expression. As he approached his central point, True strength, Mr. President, is not shown by how effectively we can keep people out. True strength is shown by how generously we can welcome them in while maintaining our security and our values. America has done this before. America can do this again. President Trump's face was now visibly flushed. His hands gripped the arms of his chair as he stared at the Pope with undisguised intensity. Members of his staff in the gallery looked increasingly uncomfortable, knowing their boss was being challenged in the most public way possible. But the most remarkable thing wasn't the Pope's bold words. It was his demeanor, while delivering what amounted to a direct rebuke of American immigration policy. He maintained the same gentle, pastoral tone he might use while comforting a grieving family. There was no anger, no hostility, no personal attack, just calm moral clarity. As Pope Leo XIV continued his remarks, developing his theological argument for more humane immigration policies, you could feel the tension in the room reaching a breaking point. This wasn't just a policy disagreement anymore. It was a clash between two fundamentally different visions of American leadership and moral authority. The President of the United States, representing power, nationalism, and pragmatic politics, versus the Pope, representing mercy, universalism, and prophetic witness. Both men commanded massive global audiences. Both claimed to speak for America's best traditions, and now they were in direct public conflict. Vatican observers later said they had never seen Pope Leo XIV speak with such passionate conviction. His words were carefully chosen, but devastating in their clarity. A nation's greatness, he declared, is not measured by its ability to exclude, but by its capacity to include, not by the height of its walls, but by the breadth of its welcome. As the Pope neared the end of his prepared remarks, President Trump was seen whispering urgently to his chief of staff. The tension in the room had become almost unbearable. Diplomats, journalists, and religious leaders all understood they were witnessing either a historic moment of moral leadership or a catastrophic breakdown in American diplomatic relations with the Vatican. Then Pope Leo XIV did something that nobody in the room expected. Instead of returning to his seat after delivering what amounted to a comprehensive rejection of Trump's immigration philosophy, he remained at the podium, directly at the president, and prepared to do something that would transform the entire meaning of this confrontation. The room held its breath. This was the moment that would define not just the rest of the conference, but possibly the rest of both men's legacies. Pope Leo XIV stood at the podium for what felt like an eternity, his eyes fixed on President Trump. The silence in the General Assembly Hall was deafening. Every person in the room understood they were balanced on the edge of either a diplomatic disaster or something unprecedented. Then the Pope did something that nobody could have predicted. Instead of returning to his seat after delivering his President Trump, the president's security detail tensed immediately. Secret Service agents subtly adjusted their positions, hands moving closer to their jackets. But the Pope's body language radiated nothing but peaceful intention. His steps were slow, deliberate, non-threatening as he approached the president's seat. Pope Leo XIV's voice carried clearly through the hall's sound system. He was speaking, but not into any microphone. His words were being picked up by the sensitive equipment designed to capture every nuance of, not as a critic of your policies, but as a fellow American who loves this country as much as you do. Trump looked up at the approaching Pope with a mixture of wariness and curiosity. The two men had met briefly at several state functions, but never under circumstances remotely like these. When the Pope reached Trump's row, he didn't stop at a respectful distance. Instead, he sat down in the empty chair directly beside the president. The informality of the gesture sent shockwaves through the diplomatic community. Popes don't abandon protocol to sit beside world leaders during official UN proceedings. The cameras zoomed in as Pope Leo XIV turned his body to face Trump directly. The entire world could see both men's faces clearly now. The president looked genuinely surprised by this unprecedented breach of diplomatic etiquette. "Mr. President," the Pope said, his voice now softer, but still clearly audible, "I know you're a man who prays. I know you believe in God's providence over America, so I want to ask you to join me in something right now, in front of all these people, in front of the whole world." Trump's expression shifted from wariness to genuine curiosity. Whatever he had been expecting from this confrontation, It wasn't this. The Pope's tone carried none of the challenging edge from his speech. This was pastoral, personal, almost intimate, despite the public setting. "I want us to pray together," the Pope continued, "for wisdom in how we treat the most vulnerable people who come to our borders. Not for you to agree with my policies, and not for me to agree with yours, but for both of us to seek God's heart on this matter." The request hung in the air like a challenge and an invitation simultaneously. President Trump, who had built his political career on projecting strength and never backing down, was being asked to pray publicly with the man who had just criticized him in front of the entire world. For nearly 30 seconds, Trump said nothing. You could see him calculating the political implications, weighing the risks and benefits. Republican strategists would later describe this as one of the most dangerous moments of Trump's political career. Then something remarkable happened. Trump's expressions softened in a way that millions of Americans had rarely seen. The combative politician faded, replaced by something more human, more vulnerable. "Your Holiness," he said, his voice unusually quiet, "I've never had a pope ask me to pray with him before." The admission carried an almost childlike wonder that was completely at odds with his usual commanding presence. Pope Leo XIV smiled with genuine warmth. "Then this will be a first for both of us. Mr. President, I've never prayed publicly with a president either. Perhaps God is calling us both to step outside our comfort zones." Without waiting for a response, the Pope extended his hand to Trump, not for a handshake, but palm up, inviting the president to take it. The gesture was so simple, so human, that it cut through all the political complexity of the moment. Trump looked at the extended hand for several seconds. The entire General Assembly Hall was silent, except for the soft clicking of camera shutters. Then, slowly, the President of the United States placed his hand in the Pope's. Pope Leo XIV closed his eyes and began to pray aloud, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. "Heavenly Father, we come before you as two imperfect men who love America and want what's best for her people. We disagree about methods, but we share the desire to protect families and preserve human dignity." As the Pope prayed, something extraordinary began happening in the Assembly Hall. The adversarial atmosphere that had dominated the morning began to dissipate. World leaders who had been taking sides in what seemed like a brewing diplomatic crisis found themselves witnessing something else entirely, a moment of genuine spiritual leadership. "Grant us wisdom, Lord," the Pope continued, "to see beyond our political differences to the human faces behind every policy decision. Help us remember that every immigrant, every refugee, every person seeking a better life is someone's child, someone's parent, someone precious to you." President Trump, his head now bowed and his eyes closed, began to look less like a political figure and more like a man genuinely engaged in prayer. Several observers later reported that they could see his lips moving silently, as if he were adding his own petitions to the Pope's words. And Father, Pope Leo XIV continued, "Give us the courage to lead with both strength and compassion, to secure our borders and welcome the stranger, to protect our citizens and honor our values as a nation, founded on the principle that all people are created equal." When the Pope finished, the two men remained seated with their heads bowed for several more seconds. The silence in the hall was no longer tense or uncomfortable. It was reverent, almost sacred. Finally, both men opened their eyes and looked at each other. What passed between them in that moment was impossible to capture on camera. But everyone in the room could see that something fundamental had shifted. The confrontation had been transformed into something else entirely, a moment of genuine human connection across deep political divides. President Trump was the first to speak, and his words would be quoted in newspapers around the world. "Your Holiness," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion, "thank you for reminding me that this isn't just about politics. It's about people." The Pope squeezed the president's hand once more before releasing it. "And thank you, Mr. President, for showing the world that even in our disagreements, we can still come together before God." As both men stood up, the entire General Assembly Hall erupted in applause. But this wasn't the polite, diplomatic clapping that usually punctuated UN events. This was spontaneous, emotional recognition of something unprecedented. Two of the most powerful men in the world had just demonstrated that moral leadership sometimes means setting aside winning and losing. In favor of seeking truth together, the moment would be analyzed, criticized, and celebrated for months to come. But in that instant, everyone in the room understood they had witnessed something that transcended politics, the power of genuine spiritual authority to transform conflict into collaboration. As the applause continued, Pope Leo XIV and President Trump remained standing side by side, both men clearly moved by what had just transpired. The cameras captured every nuance of their expressions: the Pope's serene satisfaction, the President's genuine emotion, and the palpable sense that something historic had just occurred. The immediate aftermath was unlike anything veteran UN observers had ever witnessed. Both men seemed genuinely reluctant to leave the moment behind. Secretary General Rodriguez, clearly improvising, approached the microphone to announce an extended recess. But before he could speak, President Trump raised his hand and asked to address the assembly once more. What Trump said next would be remembered as one of the most unexpected moments of his presidency. "Your Holiness," he began, looking directly at the Pope, "has reminded me of something I think I'd forgotten in all the noise of politics. We can disagree on policy and still recognize each other's humanity. We can debate methods and still share the same ultimate goals." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "I still believe America needs strong borders. I still believe we have to enforce our immigration laws. But His Holiness is right about one thing. We can't let policy disagreements make us forget that we're talking about real people with real families and real dreams." The admission was stunning in its honesty. Here was a politician known for never backing down, never admitting error, acknowledging publicly that a religious leader had challenged him to think differently about one of his signature issues. Pope Leo XIV's response was equally gracious. "Mr. President, you've shown today why America continues to command respect around the world. Not because your nation is perfect, but because your leaders are willing to grow, to listen, and to seek wisdom beyond their own understanding." The Pope then turned to address the broader assembly. "What we've witnessed here today is not about immigration policy or American politics. It's about something much more fundamental. The possibility that we can disagree without demonizing, challenge without destroying, and lead without losing our souls." Social media exploded immediately. Within minutes, hashtags like #Pope and President and #prayer over politics were trending worldwide. News networks scrambled to analyze what the unprecedented moment might mean for American politics, Catholic-Protestant relations, and international diplomacy. But the most significant reactions came from ordinary Americans watching at home. Catholic voter Margaret Sullivan from Ohio would later tell reporters, "I've been torn between my faith and my politics for years. Today, I saw that maybe I don't have to choose. Maybe I can be both a faithful Catholic and a supporter of strong borders." Evangelical pastor Mike Henderson in Texas had a different but equally significant response. "I've had my differences with the Pope's theology, but what he did today was pure Christian leadership. He showed that you can speak truth to power with both courage and love." The polling data that emerged over the following weeks revealed the profound impact of what became known as the UN prayer moment. Trump's approval rating among Catholics, which had been declining, stabilized and even increased slightly in some demographics. But more significantly, polls showed increased support across all religious groups for what respondents described as a more compassionate approach to immigration. Perhaps the most telling indicator of the moment's impact came from an unexpected source: late-night television. Comedians who had built careers mocking both Trump and religious leaders found themselves struggling to satirize what had occurred. Saturday Night Live's attempted sketch about the event was widely criticized as tone-deaf and mean-spirited. Jimmy Kimmel, known for his sharp political humor, opened his show that night by simply saying, "Sometimes something happens that's too genuine to make fun of." The Vatican reported receiving over 100,000 emails in the week following the UN event, with the vast majority expressing gratitude for Pope Leo XIV's leadership. More surprisingly, the White House Communications Office noted a significant shift in the tone of correspondence they received about immigration policy. Letters that had previously been either harshly critical or unquestioningly supportive now reflected more nuanced thinking about the balance between security and compassion. 3 months later, the full impact of the UN prayer moment became clear when President Trump signed the Border Security and Human Dignity Act, a bipartisan compromise That had seemed impossible before the Pope's intervention. The legislation increased funding for border security while also expanding legal pathways for immigration and providing more humane treatment for asylum seekers. At the signing ceremony, Trump specifically credited Pope Leo XIV with helping him understand that strength and compassion aren't enemies. The Pope, who attended via video link from Vatican City, offered a brief blessing for the new law and the bipartisan cooperation that had made it possible, complained that the legislation didn't go far enough in either direction. Immigration hawks argued that Trump had gone soft under PayPal influence. Progressive activists claimed the Pope had provided religious cover for continued harsh enforcement. But polling consistently showed that a majority of Americans across party lines supported what they saw as a more balanced approach. The long-term implications of that morning at the United Nations continue to unfold. Pope Leo XIV's demonstration that moral authority could transcend political boundaries inspired religious leaders across denominations to engage more directly with contentious political issues, not as partisan advocates but as voices, calling for higher principles. President Trump, while never abandoning his core political positions, began incorporating more explicitly compassionate language into his immigration rhetoric. His 2025 re-election campaign featured ads showing his prayer with the Pope, positioning him as a leader capable of growth and willing to seek divine guidance. More broadly, the UN prayer moment became a template for political discourse in an era of intense polarization. The phrase, "What would the Pope do?" became shorthand for approaching political disagreements with both conviction and humility. As I finish telling you this story, I can't help but think about what we witnessed that day in the United Nations General Assembly Hall. Two powerful men, representing very different approaches to leadership, found a way to disagree respectfully and seek common ground without abandoning their principles. In our current political climate, where every disagreement becomes a battle for the soul of America, Pope Leo XIV showed us another way. He demonstrated that you can speak prophetically against policies you believe are wrong while still treating your opponents with dignity and respect. President Trump, for his part, showed that even the most combative politicians can be moved by genuine spiritual authority exercised with wisdom and grace. So here's my question for you. In your own life, in your own political conversations, in your own community disagreements, what would it look like to disagree like Pope Leo XIV and President Trump did that day? What would it mean to hold fast to your convictions while remaining open to growth? What would change if we all approached our opponents not as enemies to be defeated, but as fellow Americans to be understood? The world is watching America right now, wondering whether we can still find ways to come together across our deepest differences. Pope Leo XIV and President Trump showed us it's possible. The question is whether the rest of us have the courage to follow their example. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments below. Share your thoughts about how we can bring more of this spirit into our own political conversations. And if you want to see more stories about moments when moral leadership transformed seemingly impossible situations, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell because at the end of the day, this isn't just a story about a pope and a president. It's a story about the power of faith, humility, and genuine human connection to overcome even the deepest political divisions. It's a reminder that in a world full of noise and anger, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply invite someone to pray with you. Thanks for watching, and remember, the next time you find yourself in sharp disagreement with someone whose politics you can't stand, ask yourself what Pope Leo XIV would do. You might be surprised by the answer. God bless, and I'll see you in the next video.